Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Vanessa Guthrie. I'm the Deputy Chair of the West Australian Cricket Association, or fondly known as the WACA, and I'd like to welcome you to today's CEDA live stream event, the Australia's Sports Economy, More Than a Game. Today we'll be discussing the economic and social contribution of the sports sector makes to the national economy. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge that where I am today, I am sitting on Whadjuk people's country of the Noongar Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this country, as I would for all of those wherever you are in Australia, and thank those elders for sharing country with us. Today's event is being live streamed because, like many organisations, CEDA has suspended attendance at public events. But CEDA remains true to its purpose in these testing times of providing platforms to inform and promote debate on critical issues, and that's why we're doing this event via a live stream. Over the coming months, CEDA will be making a range of events across key issues available in digital formats to ensure our members and the community more broadly can access discussion on the most important issues impacting Australia's economic and social development. As details of those events are confirmed, they'll be made available on the CEDA website at ceda.com.au, so I encourage you to check back for those details. CEDA will also be producing regular podcasts and video interviews with leading experts and policymakers to ensure we can all remain up to date with quality information on key issues impacting the economy more broadly. Today, like at public CEDA events, you'll still be able to interact with the speakers through our Q&A portal, which is available via the link below the video on your screen. So I encourage you to add your questions, and we'll be able to moderate those questions after the speakers. We also have a poll today around funding for sport, and I encourage you also to vote in that poll, which we will share the results of at the end. Now, I'd like to extend a warm welcome to everyone online, as well as our speakers, to lead this important discussion. Today's speakers are Matt Carroll, AM, the CEO of the Australian Olympic Committee, Peggy O'Neill, AO, the President of the Richmond Football Club, and Nicholas Hudson, Senior Manager for the Government and Public Sector at EY in Canberra. But just to set some context before I hand over to our speakers, I thought I'd like to share with you some of the thoughts that I have around sport in our economy, and particularly given my passion around cricket. It's fair to say that we can all see the direct impact that the pandemic has had on our sport. We are not getting to the football, we're not getting to the rugby, we're not getting to the soccer, we're not taking our kids to netball. And that there is a significant and direct impact clearly on our players, on our sports administrators, and even on our international position in sport, particularly with the delay of the Olympics. But the impact is much broader than just what we see or are missing in terms of being at events. It goes to more deeply economically to things like broadcast rights. It goes to events management, transportation, catering, accommodation, flights, and tourism. And more deeply, it goes to the heart of our community, because sport is deeply in Australia's DNA. And every weekend, parents are not being able to take their children to play their chosen sport. So it is very much part of our fabric of society in Australia. And the challenge I think we have, and we'd like to explore today, is not just that direct economic impact, but what's the deeper social impact and cultural impact on the well-being of Australian society when we're unable to access sport in other ways, the ways that we might have. So with that, I'd like to hand to our first speaker, Matt Carroll, And Matt will then hand to Peggy, and Peggy to Nicholas, and then I will come back to moderate the session. So please, Matt, welcome to Matt. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Vanessa, and good afternoon to all. Just give a quick rundown of where the Australian Olympic Committee and our sports are at. Interesting, but not amazingly, there was no file under P for postponement of the Games, being the first one in history. But that having been said, Games planning is well underway, not only with ourselves, we'll come to, but also the organising committee in Tokyo and the IOC. Yes, it's not simple, and it's going to be exceptionally expensive. The rescheduling has already been done for the same time period starting on the 27th of July in 2021, the same venues, same Olympic Village that have been able to negotiate with the developers there. But interestingly and understandingly, a simpler and a lower cost delivery to save dollars. Obviously, because of the global nature of the Games, the IOC has committed $800 million US to support the postponement. So things they would have spent the money on development of sport across the globe is going to have to go into the postponement, and that includes 150 million US for the international federations and the National Olympic Committees to support them through basically an extra year. As Vanessa alluded to, there's been a cancellation of many world championships, which have affected the international federation's revenues, and also therefore the earning capacity of a lot of the athletes as well, in terms of any prize money and sponsorship. So it has had a significant effect, as you could imagine. Importantly, athletes and teams that are qualified remain qualified for the Games, so there's no extra work for there, but obviously preparation. But there are still a number of qualifying events which will have to be undertaken next year. They're going to keep it as tight as possible to the start of the Games. Obviously at the AOC, we've recut our cloth to carry over the Australian team planning delivery. Still looking to be one of the largest teams to leave our shores, about 480 athletes, plus coaches, medical trainers, meaning about 1,000 Australians. Our planning is obviously based on advice from the IOC and World Health, and obviously the Australian government and the AIS. And all our planning has been based on no vaccine being available. If it does become available, well, obviously a game changer for all. There's still a lot of ifs. It's a bit hard to do it. We have to be very agile in our planning. But around August, we should have more information on exactly what will be in place, particularly around health protocols, and that will affect both the athletes and people attending the Games. Ourselves, we've provided an additional $2.5 million to support athletes in their extended preparation. And good thing is all our sponsors, we've extended their contract into 2021. They've been very supportive and committed, and we're working with them, as I'm sure a lot of sports are, around digital initiatives, which is ensuring they're still going to get value for their investment during the course of this year. With our 45 member sports, so that's about 9 million Australian participants, so very much wide into the community. As Vanessa was saying, it's not just about the performance end of sport. The same as for the domestic football codes, competition events have been cancelled from the local community to international events. So everyone's suffering a bit financially. Sport economy is very important to Australia. It's around about 50 billion annually. And there's that knock-on effect as it suffers as well with obviously suppliers and retail infrastructure, travel and tourism, apart from broadcast. But it is the health and wellbeing benefit the sport delivers, I think, that is most important, particularly this time. And has been the focus of the Olympic sports and the AOC during the pandemic. Yes, we've rescaled our business, but also innovating. So sports and athletes, online and digital programs support their communities, and of course, now importantly, the measured, careful return to sport. Interestingly, our skills program, Olympics Unleashed, normally Olympians in the classrooms talking to students, moved to digital. 50 schools last week, with Olympians delivering important messages to kids, particularly this time, sticking with it. So important for their mental health and wellbeing as well. For our Olympic hopefuls, working with our sports and with the AIS, they're rebooting athlete training, and that important Australia-New Zealand bubble that may open up later this year will be important for the preparation for the Games. But I guess, looking ahead beyond 2021, we're very positive. The Winter Games in Beijing in 2022, Paris 24, and LA in 28. Strong opportunities, both engendering support of the community for sport, but also for the commercial opportunities to maintain the investment. I guess looking a bit further ahead, 2032 Queensland Olympic Games, which would crown a decade of sport. We've already got the Women's Basketball World Cup in 2022, the Road Cycling World Championships same year. Australia's bidding for the FIFA Football Women's World Cup and the Men's Rugby World Cup, 23 and 27. So there's lots of opportunity to bring economic benefit to the country, but importantly inspire an entire generation coming up over the next 10 years. So we're taking a very positive and hopeful approach to everything we're doing, and that's the way our athletes are preparing for the game. So yes, there's a few tough times, but we think with adequate support and good planning, good thinking, and that good dose of resilience, sport will come through, and Australian sport's very good at that. I'll hand over to you, Peggy.
Thanks, Matt. In talking about the sports economy, it occurred to me that I was a fan of the game for a very long time, and I sort of became interested in the business of football. And I thought, how do you make money here? And I think that's still the question we're asking, especially in these kind of tough times. So I thought I'd set the scene just by explaining some of the structure around the AFL, so you can understand how this largest domestic competition works and sort of the issues that we're facing. The AFL itself is an independent commission, and then there are 18 clubs like Richmond that I'm president of. There are 2 expansion clubs that are at varying degrees of development, and all the clubs are at different levels of financial security. The clubs are, in essence, shareholders in the AFL, and each shareholder gets a flat distribution each year, sort of a dividend from the AFL. And then some clubs get additional funding depending on their circumstances and AFL approval. Now, the revenue streams, as Vanessa sort of mentioned, there are really only 3. And looking at the AFL, it's different than what the individual clubs might have. For example, broadcasting, sponsors, and crowd attendances are the 3 main revenue streams for the AFL. And for example, if no games were played this year, in broadcasting, there'd be a $400 million loss. Sponsors, $50 million. Crowd attendance is $100 million. Now, it's been announced that there will resume play on the 11th of June, but that won't restore everything because there still won't be crowd attendances, and it's still not a full year of games. And at Richmond, we have the same sort of revenue stream with respect to sponsors, but one of the big things that underpin most clubs is membership, and we're fortunate to have the largest membership, 103,000. And of course, we need to speak to our members, which we're doing now, about if you're not playing any games, or if you're playing games and I'm not allowed to attend, what does that mean? So everyone has to sort through what that means to the bottom line. And then clubs can have other business interests, and that's where pokies come in for most clubs. Some have different sorts of businesses. For example, we have a sport and recreation management business, and we also have an education business in partnership with Swinburne University that gives us a different revenue streams in normal circumstances. But when all the clubs are shut down, where the poker machines might be, and when you can't attend class anymore, you sort of have to come up with a new way of doing that business. I think it's also important to remember that the AFL and all the clubs are not for profit. So they don't look to create or to maintain great reserves. And so when any of these streams dries up, it's a big issue. But when they all dry up or come under stress, you can see that it's even a bigger issue. And if the clubs are expecting a dividend based on what the AFL might earn, and then those earnings go down, you can see the dividends are also affected. Now, there's been a salary cap for players for a very long time. And about 6 years ago, the AFL introduced what they call a soft cap. And that's on non-football player expenditure, the coaches' high performance. And there's never been any limit on what you can expend on the administration side of the business. And there are actually more people in administration than in football departments. And those are the people who run community programs, the people in media, the people in merchandising, the people in membership, and the people who run functions. So if you're not playing games and you aren't able to go to your place of work, and you aren't having crowds at games, and you can't have functions, you can see the ripple effect on employment through every club and the entire AFL. Also, the AFL has said many times and has renewed its commitment to have 18 clubs in the competition. And with 2 expansion clubs, there's been a significant amount of money going into them. There are also clubs that all along have had significant debt or insufficient cash flow for all kinds of reasons. But they've nonetheless been supported by the AFL in various ways. And that's a distribution over and above the base distribution that we all get. So when an event happens that cuts the AFL revenue again like this, there's an immediate flow-on effect to those clubs in trouble as their guarantor or their source of funding, the AFL, is also under stress. And you probably have read in the paper, those of you who follow this competition, that the AFL was able to secure a $400 million line of credit to help clubs that needed funding, the clubs it was also helping, but it was also needed to keep itself afloat through this pandemic crisis. And that was just unprecedented that everything would collapse at the same time. As part of that, obtaining the line of credit, there was a letter of financial assistance that each club had to sign. And what that really did was divide the clubs into those who needed assistance and those who were unassisted. There were only about 6, and Richmond was one of those who didn't need any AFL assistance through that line of credit for the foreseeable short term, I suppose. None of us know exactly what's going to happen. And in effect, this was those who needed the AFL support to stay solvent this financial year and who can go it alone. So there was quite a bit of work as to forecasting into a really uncertain future about what kind of money you're going to have as cash flow and what you're going to need, how many employees you're going to have, and what other rules might come in through the AFL. And as you would expect, if you accept the money from the AFL, there's all sorts of strings attached regarding expenditure, as you would expect with any kind of loan. For example, no debt can be increased by those clubs who are assisted with outside the AFL money. Monthly budgets have to be submitted, expenditure has to be approved. But I think importantly, the AFL was able to get that line of credit through conventional banking sources because 2 years ago it exercised an option and it bought Marvel Stadium. So it had an asset for security to those lenders. It didn't have to hope that the government could come through in some way. And that asset was slated for redevelopment and having a stadium to play games, but now it's security for these loans. But like all debts, that loan from the AFL will have to be repaid. The loans from all the clubs will have to be repaid. And what that means for what the competition is going to look like, the size and staffing of all the clubs, all of that's going to undoubtedly have to change. I say we do have a future, but it's not going to look like the past at all. And I think we just have to get used to the idea that ones who get on top of that new future and adapt the quickest will have sort of the most success. So I'll leave it there for now. That's sort of about the economics of what's happened. I haven't even touched on what it's meant to all the staff and the economics of who's going to work there and the employment crisis that is created. And understand that we'll have some time to talk about the community side and what that means, what sport means to the community, which is something that we're going to delve into more in the Q&A, I understand. So now I'll turn over to Nicholas.
Thanks, Peggy. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Good to be here with you online. Look, I'll give you a bit of context to where government and government investment and policy sits in sports in Australia, and to give you a bit of insight into some of the challenges around COVID and post-COVID. So government of all levels of federal, state, and territory provide a wide variety of funding and support of different levels, and calling out some high-performance sports, especially in Olympic, Paralympic, and Commonwealth sports in schools, local clubs and communities, major events, and contributing obviously to infrastructure for sport, as well as access to facilities that maybe local councils may have. So government touches on sport in a lot of different ways, in a lot of different aspects, and obviously there is obviously the policy and regulatory levers that government can support sport. So sport provides obviously a range of positive benefits for society, health benefits, mental and physical health, social benefits, social cohesion, national pride, economic benefits, obviously, with major events and tourism as examples. It's even been used as national security benefits on countering violence extremism. So it is a tool that government and a lot of areas of society uses as to get these outcomes. Now, with the arrival of COVID, the government, as we all know, has obviously taken a health protection strategy approach. And in doing so, has obviously committed a lot of money around job protection and other measures to support industries during the shutdown of COVID. And this is leaving a really big deficit and a very tight budget setting now and into the future that will really start constraining for non-essential services and especially non-recovery efforts. And I'll come to this a little bit later. So as we start emerging from COVID and start to slowly reopen, and governments focus their attention from health protection to economic recovery across the country, easing of restrictions for sports will obviously mean re-engaging with fans, participants, restarting professional competitions, and shoring up revenue streams and taking advantage of what actually may come out of COVID. It'll be important for sports to be working closely with governments, especially state and territory governments, on that competition lens, especially with the concern of a risk of a second wave of COVID occurring. I think sport's in a relatively good place post-COVID to really contribute to Australia's recovery. But it does have some challenges. And the key one being around that the benefits of sport can be very difficult to quantify, especially when presenting to a funding proposal for government. We can, through, if it's a major event or a tourism attraction, we can quantify the economic benefits, bed nights, tourism dollars, etc. But bigger questions, and these have been around for a while, around how do you measure the social cohesion? How do you prove avoided hospitalisation from improved physical health? How do you measure improved well-being and happiness? And when you think about government and how they make their decisions on funding, especially in a post-COVID world where they'll be really focusing on economic recovery and job creation and the typical things that government will be doing to focus on improving the economy. These decisions are not made in isolation, but obviously against competing priorities and competing initiatives. So the benefits that any proposal or initiative needs to provide needs to be quantified and be able to compete against these other priorities. So look, from the sports sector position, obviously it's well documented about the social and economic benefits that everything provides, and it is in a good place. I think the challenge going forward, especially with the window when we're going to see when and how much government will fund and how they'll go about that. Is it purely a funding, or is it a policy or a regulatory mechanism they may relax to support the economic recovery? And how can we position sport to be a key contributor in that, especially on that social side in bringing the communities together? So some really interesting, I guess, challenges coming forward, and certainly hopefully through this conversation we'll be able to draw some out a bit more. So Vanessa, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Nick. So a fabulous introduction to and three very different perspectives, and thank you for your insights, Matt, Peggy and Nick. I'd encourage everyone watching to get online and post some questions, and we now have about half an hour to post some questions to our panel. Peggy, I might start with you with my first question, and while others online think about and post theirs. Just back to, you went deeply through the economic impact and the direct economic impact, and referenced to the community impact. I wonder if you could just explore a little further. What do you think what have we learned from the pandemic about the importance of community sport, and particularly for children, not only children, but for adults and all the way through life, the importance of sport in our community and the importance of community sport to the fabric of Australia?
Well, I think it's it's made us miss a lot what isn't there, that perhaps we took things for granted, and now we realize the place that sport played in the lives of so many of us, whether at the elite level, community sports, grassroots, competing for fun or competing for points in a premiership. I think that the community cohesion and the family time that people have around sport, I know that I'm always touched, and I used to be surprised, but I'm not anymore, when I receive letters from people who talk about the great family times they had in going to the football, whether it be junior football or going to professional football. And especially as they lose family members, they reflect on those wonderful times. I think also that sport is a great way, and you can probably tell by my accent, I'm not a native Australian. It's a great way to integrate new communities in Australia, because once you have a team, or once you're part of a sport, or once people know that you're interested in the same thing they're interested in, you feel like you belong. And I know I felt that way, that once I had a team, I could take part in that conversation that a lot of my community had for most of the year. So I think that we can't underestimate the value of people finding their feet in a new environment by having sport to turn to. I also serve on a couple of panels. I'm on the AFL Mental Health Steering Committee, and also on the AIS Athlete Engagement and Wellbeing Advisory Panel. And the effect on mental health, we've all thought that there was a mental health crisis before the pandemic came along. But we realize as we're isolated more, that the mental health issues are likely to be exacerbated. And I know recent talk that I participated in the steering committee for the AFL is that the tail of this from a mental health standpoint is going to be with us for a very long time. And I think that a lot of that is just being removed from what was our routine, removed from the people that were part of our lives, the team that we like to be part of. So I think we've learned that sport makes a contribution to the community in a way perhaps that we did take for granted, and now we know the primary place that it has for all sorts of reasons, physical and mental, and just good public health.
Yeah, undoubtedly, Peggy. It's quite critical, particularly I think in your comments around integration of new arrivals in Australia. We've certainly seen that in spades, in particular in the AFL. So, Matt, turning to the more international platform, and many of the sports that are Olympic sports might not be as visible as some of our major sports like AFL and cricket and soccer. For those athletes who have been desperately working hard to a target in a 4-year window, and suddenly that target's been moved out, how do you keep them motivated? How do they keep themselves motivated? And how do they, and some of them, particularly towards the end of their careers, perhaps this might be their last Olympics and they've got to keep training for an extra year. And given the international spread of this pandemic, what are we seeing in terms of our athletes versus other athletes around the world, where we're all equally impacted in this way?
You've covered a number of topics there. Look, I guess in terms of our athletes' preparation, and you would have seen that in the announcements that the AAC made just before the postponement of the Games, was to provide certainty. That's what the athletes communicated back to us, and that certainty was essential. So the decision that we had to make, that we just couldn't prepare a team to go to the Tokyo Games with the restrictions that were coming in on travel and assembly, just made that impossible. As it was, a couple of days later, the International Olympic Committee postponed the Games. And with the International Olympic Committee, what they didn't want to do was cancel the Games for the reasons that you just alluded to, about all the athletes have been preparing for 4 or more years to A, qualify, and B, get to the Games. There's not too many people on the planet that get to go to an Olympic Games and represent their country across a multitude of sports. So the IOC was very focused on ensuring there would be, at worst case scenario, was a postponement. And that certainty that the qualification system was still in place. So if you had already qualified the Games, so the Matildas have already qualified to represent Australia in football, they will still go to the Games. There's no other qualification process. The same for individual athletes who in paddle have already qualified. They will be going to the Games. And that's what and I guess the other thing we intended, we kept communicating with athletes. So we had weekly similar calls to this, where Ian Chestham, our chef de mission, and myself as the CEO could brief the athletes on what was happening, what was progressing, and be able to give them up-to-date information the whole time. And the same thing for the chief executives of our sports as well. That information flow was very important to ensure that about that certainty, and therefore be able to rejig their own personal plans. And I think during this period of the pandemic, you would have seen online a lot of Olympians and athletes have been, sharing their training with the community, sharing their preparation. That sort of, as I said, stick with it, that resilience. So that's been very important, both for the athlete, giving back to the community, but also for their own personal self-worth as well. It's showing, demonstrating how they're getting on with it. On the bigger picture, yes, look, it is one of the reasons with the Games, the discussion before it was postponed, was there was this concern about an even playing field. As the pandemic took off in different ways in different countries, there was a concern that some athletes would be able to prepare and some couldn't. And therefore, that even playing field is very important. It was important to the athletes as well as the sports and the IOC. That still is an issue going forward. Obviously, Australia is probably one of the best placed countries on the planet at the moment. The low infection rate, the fact we've got a big country, the fact we've got fantastic facilities, preparation and planning for the Games can go ahead. We're in the right time zone. Translate that to in South America and other parts of the planet at the moment, where the virus is still may yet to reach its peak. That they are issues which the World Health and the IOC are monitoring. And as I said in the introduction, a drug would be a game changer to help both athletes and also the Games themselves. What the IOC is doing, well, for countries such as ourselves, US, Canada, UK, the National Olympic Committees in the sports are pretty well organised and supported by governments such as the Australian Institute of Sport, as Peggy alluded to. But for those smaller or countries aren't as wealthy, the International Olympic Committee, through their Olympic Solidarity, is supporting those athletes as well. So it's with their own programs and also for their mental health. So they're trying to avoid anyone missing out. And what we also do is a lot of sharing. We share our programs with other National Olympic Committees around the world, what initiatives we're doing, and they get on shared to other countries. We're all working in this, as we say, we're in this together. It's the same for the Olympic movement.
Thanks, Nat. A question from the audience, and it's probably to any of you, but Peggy, you might want to open up with the answer here. Do you think that the current crisis has put a spotlight on some of the governing bodies, and an inquiry should be held into the management of the codes, especially where public money flows to that code? And I know it's through cricket, even though we're off season and AFL on season, there is this balancing act between trying to be a not-for-profit and provide a service, but also maintain sufficient revenue and your cost base so that you can be sustainable through the downtimes. So, Peggy, your views on that?
Well, the big picture, I don't think there's a need for an inquiry. I think sport's no different than what's happening out in the rest of the business world. No one saw this coming to the extent and the impact that it would have. I think that this may highlight that you can't always assume things are going to keep growing and you're going to keep making more money and that things will always stay the same. But as you were saying, Vanessa, there's a balance you have to strike about spending money on the growth of the game as you earn it, and then having enough reserves to see you through what would be perhaps a normal downturn, as opposed to a downturn where the bottom drops out of everything you've been doing as far as revenue streams. So I think that organizations, all the clubs, for example, in the AFL and AFL Commission itself, will probably just as a matter of course, have a review about what have you learned? What could we have done better? We can't say that this will never happen again, but we could have perhaps been better prepared with hindsight. And I remember that as part of our strategic plan at Richmond last year, just because we thought there was going to be a recession the next 10 years, we started thinking about, well, if there's a recession, how long can we go without any money? How many members can we afford to lose and still maintain what we're doing? And we hadn't developed that very far, but we were starting to think the good times can't go on forever. But I think that sporting clubs and sporting organizations mostly have to do a lot with a little, and they rely quite a bit on volunteers. They rely a lot on young people who perhaps don't get paid what they could be paid out in other businesses because they love sport and they want to be part of the excitement of competitive sport. So I think there are lessons to be learned, but I don't think an inquiry is necessary.
Thank you. Second question from the audience. Nick, you might be well placed to explore this one. What are the gendered impacts of the reduced funding in the sports economy? And in particular, will diversity and inclusion still be a focus for sporting organisations and I guess from a government perspective around funding?
Yeah, it's a good question, especially when you're looking at disruption of revenue streams, which obviously there's been a very big push in professional sports in increasing women's competition and inclusion of women in the professional scene, and especially probably the timing as well. With you looking at the timing of that, some of this is coming at the end of some of the women's professional seasons that have kind of ended abruptly. Look, in terms of going forward, I think there is still a commitment, absolute commitment from government and everyone in society around that gender equality, especially in sport and moving through the different levels from participation, physical activity participation up to elite and professional sports. The question will be, out of COVID, how can each of the sports organisations think about that resilience factor so that you don't have to choose between the one that they actually are on an equal footing. If you think about priorities from government around infrastructure and if they are going to roll out an infrastructure program as part of a stimulus measure, well, obviously there's a huge demand around facilities for women's sports to be able to improve those across the board, across a variety of different sports. And so there will always be a demand to increase support and access for women in sport. But certainly, maybe one of those lessons out of COVID is that resilience factor of each of the sports organisations around, well, how's this revenue stream, or how's these changes that are impacting us? How's that affecting the equality of women entering the game, and that gender question into the future? It's probably even more of an opportunity to get that equal footing going forward. I mean, no one could see COVID coming, and you can talk about resilience until you're blue in the face, but how resilient can you be against something like COVID shutting down everything? But certainly going forward, I think there is an absolute opportunity in improving that even further to get that on an equal footing. And some of the lessons out of COVID will also be how much we've all used technology to stay connected. As much as there is a huge mental burden, there is also a huge ability to now connect even further through technology. And we've seen that in netball, and a lot of different sports have done social media campaigns on keeping connected with fans. And I think there's an opportunity there in again, just increasing that foothold and continue to drive for that equality in women's sport.
Excellent. Another question from our audience. it's goes more to sponsors than government here. So I'm going to moderate the question a little. What do you think the sponsors will be looking for to include with greater obligations for money to be distributed in the amateur level? So where do the sponsors sit in the current environment? And looking forward post-COVID, should they perhaps bypass professional organisations and be sponsoring more at the grassroots level? So what do we think the expectations of sponsors will be, one assuming that sponsors will still be there for sport going forward? Who'd like to pick that one? Peggy's looking thoughtful.
I'll just say, I guess it depends on what the sponsor is trying to achieve and what they want out of the sponsorship. If they want, for example, brand awareness, they probably want television time. And as Nick said, if we're connected through technology in ways other than the traditional, perhaps they'll look for something that way. If they just want to support the growth of a game and perhaps their local community, then perhaps community and grassroots sport is where they would be. Most sponsors, in my experience, are looking for some return on their investment. If they're looking at national competitions or international competitions, it's because they want brand awareness. And that isn't to say that many sponsors want to do good for their community. And so I think it just depends on what the sponsor is trying to achieve with its dollars, because I think they're all aware of they aren't just doing it as a favor, that they have some purpose. And I think that for big companies, their shareholders would expect that. And for local communities, they would want to be sure that it's being spent in a way that achieves what they want, and whether that's the growth of a game or just fitness and health and well-being. So I don't think there's really a one size fits all to that. It's more like the size and intention of the sponsor will find the sport that it wants. And I don't think that sponsors will turn away from sport, because it's so incredibly popular with Australians and really internationally as well. So that's sort of my quick answer.
Thanks.
Just add to that. Yep. With our sponsors, of course, we don't sell tickets, we don't sell broadcast rights or anything of that nature. So it's an association with the team and the Olympians. And I agree with what Peggy was saying, is that it depends what the sponsor's looking for. And I guess in our case, they're still very passionate about supporting the Australian team. And therefore leveraging that association with the Australian team. They do it in different ways depending on their particular market. One thing I think that is becoming more and more apparent, I sort of alluded to in the comments, was the importance of community engagement. So even though the Olympic Games is about the top end of performance sport, they're very much interested, a lot of our partners, in engagement with the community. So programs in schools, programs with Olympians themselves, even in our wellbeing works for athletes and things of that nature. So again, and it's programs that they can integrate into their own businesses with their own staff. We're finding that is becoming quite important to a sponsorship of the Australian Olympic team. And I just sort of want to go to Nick's point about government funding, which is sort of, I suppose, in some, particularly for the Olympic sports, is critical. I mean, the Olympic sports have had gender balanced, many of them, Australian rowing celebrating 100 years of women's rowing. So they've had this position in the gender balance for decades. And he's quite right, it is very important. And it's important to sponsors as well, is to ensure that you have that diversity and inclusion, not only just for getting government funding, but also for the partners as well. So I think that's something we're very much working on with our sports, to ensure that they're putting forward their best credentials in what they do, not only just in gender balance, but in the various communities across Australia. In case of, say, table tennis, great sport for the Olympics, very popular in Asia and things of that nature, but also a great sport for people who have retired. particularly around eye-hand coordination and things of that nature. So there's lots of different ways you can use sport as distinct from just in community games or international events. And I think we probably haven't done a very good job at selling it, but there's certainly plenty of research which supports it. And then that's switching back to the partners, sponsors. That's the similar sort of thing they're looking for as well. That bigger picture. So I agree with Peggy. I think sponsors will continue to invest in sport because they certainly get a return on that investment.
I just wanted to add further to what Matt said. What we're finding is more sponsors are interested in the programs you might be running or your engagement with different communities. And it isn't just about having the name on the Guernsey or having the coach's box have some brand there. But we're finding more and more that our commitment to diversity and inclusion really rings a bell with a lot of sponsors who come to us because they want to be part of either women's football, or work in Indigenous communities, or work in multicultural communities. And so I think sponsors are looking a bit deeper than a name on a jumper.
Might just add in there about Peggy's point around the scalability. Incredibly important to try and maintain those sponsors, especially on a national level for those big games, because it allows the sports to be broadcasted and allow the sport to have great reach. But similar certainly for the future, where all businesses have been impacted by COVID, is the importance to ensure that the local level, the community level, where you've got local hockey clubs or the netball club or the local AFL club, continue to get that local sponsorship by the baker down the road, the pub on the corner where they hold their functions. That local connection is really important for those local clubs, for that community cohesion. It really does bring together things and gives that local aspect of pride and town pride and pride in the club as well. And they've got different drivers, and to Matt's point, they'd be looking for different outcomes than purely a commercial one. That they don't have shareholders to answer to. They've got their small medium enterprise in their local town, so they'll be looking for different outcomes. And a lot of it is purely on they are passionate about the team, they're involved in the club in some regards, or see the value in that. And certainly going forward, I think there would need to be an urgency to keep that relationship there, to keep those sponsorships there, at least to a level that allows the clubs to continue to financially from that perspective, but just to keep that community connection going forward. It's not an easy answer because all small businesses have been impacted by COVID and probably are less resilient than some of the bigger ones may be. So how that sponsorship will go forward, I don't think that's going to be lost, because there is a passion and commitment from those local sponsors. But certainly it will be a challenge on making sure that those connections still remain.
Absolutely, Nick, thanks. A question from the audience for you, Matt. How does the economic crisis impact Queensland's bid for the 2032 Olympics, do you think? And do we need to shift the messaging and rationale for the event to address it?
We've, as we said, we've very much put the candidature for 2032 on the back burner during this particular crisis. Obviously, it's far more important things. Early on the case, obviously, the health and people were dying, so the importance was on the health and well-being of the community. In terms of the Queensland candidature, look, the economic benefits are still there, and if you actually think about it in a different way, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, additional investment and drivers to bring tourists back into Australia to build towards that 2032 is actually, I would have thought, an incentive to look towards the host of the games. The hosting of the games is getting cheaper each time. I mean, I said in the opening comments, the IOC is simplifying the games, bringing the level of expectation down, not for athletes, but for what you might call the razzmatazz that goes on around it. That is coming right down. Venues can all be temporary. They don't have to be as large as they used to be as they were in the past. The Tokyo stadium for the opening and all the athletics is 60,000 people. In Sydney it was 110,000. So you can see the scale is being adjusted, and for all good reasons, and also that the what you might call the other events that happen around it, the live sites and things of that nature, they're not a requirement. That's a decision for a host. So it depends what a host wants to invest in. So the cost of the games is basically almost cost neutral now. So it's going to cost the Queensland taxpayers. The investment in infrastructure is kept to a minimum as well. Basically, IOCs, if you don't need it in the future, don't build it. Just do a temporary one. You'll see that in you'll see it in Tokyo, and you'll certainly see it in Paris. There's a lot of temporary venues in some fairly nice, iconic sites, such as around the Eiffel Tower and at the Palace of Versailles, but all temporary, so they can be taken down and moved on, but still get the economic benefit of tourism and investment in the country. The other thing is that the games brings, when the broadcasters move in, there's about 10,000 jobs created or more created locally just to support the broadcast of the game. So it's not just about infrastructure and the athletes, it's also these other add-ons as well. So I would say to everyone to have the opportunity for the 2032 games is actually be a benefit coming off the back of this crisis. And I said also the opportunity to have other international events such as the FIFA Women's World Cup. They've already got the Women's Basketball World Cup. We've got the cycling, road cycling championships. As I said, rugby union is looking at the 2027 World Cup, and there will be other events as well. So it could be a really strong decade for the economic benefits of sport, and then also importantly for that other part, which is I know Nick said it's a bit hard to measure, but I think it's quite actually easy to measure in many ways, that the tangible benefits of sport for the community, sport for schools. There's a lot of studies out there now that show that is the benefit. If you think about it, we're talking about the 8-year-olds of today who will be at the games in 2032. What a great runway that will be between now and then.
Fantastic. Nick, a question for you. In the government's budget process and the competition for the dollar from government is going to be increasingly tough in the next few years. How do you see sport positioning relative to the other potential not-for-profit activities that are important in society, like culture and the arts? And how does the government prioritise the dollar between sport and other activities?
Yeah, it's a really good question, especially when you're looking at, from a federal perspective, because a different state and territory governments play a role in the sports sector, in the community space, also in high performance as well, in conjunction with the federal government. Look, between culture and arts and sport, there is a natural friction there because they both have a really important place in our society. And it will be a very difficult balancing act between, well, how much funding and where does the funding go for sport and to what outcomes, and similar for culture and arts. I would suspect that the discussion will be more geared towards, well, what are the ultimate outcomes or what are the objectives that the government's trying to achieve in the economic recovery. To what extent do they want to focus on the social component, and the cultural and arts and sport will certainly come to that picture there, as opposed to just the pure economic jobs and growth, roll out the slogans as you would be for any government. I would think that both sport and culture and arts will be getting support in some capacity, because it's in the interest of government to get these sectors back on their feet that have been hit very, very hard. And think of it as, if the car is dead, government is the starter motor to get it going and to get the momentum going and get those sectors back on track. So I would anticipate the government will be looking at ways to how do they restart these sectors? How do they restart performance arts and culture again? And what's the best way to restart sport, to support those clubs, to support the range of sporting activities, right from your organised competitions in sport, but also to the informal and casual sports as well. COVID's shown us that we've all like to go out for a walk, get outside the house a lot more. We, go for a cycle with our families if we want to. pushing that sort of casual side. So where does government actually focus its investment in that? And it'll probably be more of a threshold question of how much do they need to invest to kickstart these sectors, to kickstart these areas, so that they can start being more self-sustaining going forward. I don't know. I mean, I've got, within arts and culture, obviously they were very early to be hit, along with tourism and other sectors. So I'd imagine that along with those tourism, other sectors, they'd also be getting their support to back on their feet. And within sport, look, I mean, you're probably looking at high performance will continue in its current way. Whether you'll get more funding for high performance, I'm not sure, but certainly maybe through indirect means, infrastructure or programs that are using sport as a tool to help social cohesion or otherwise, will probably where sport will play that role. And certainly in the budget process and in the way the government runs its programs, it's not necessarily always centralised into Sport Australia or its functions within government. You've got lots of areas in government that use sport as a mechanism. Department of Home Affairs, Attorney Generals, lots of different areas that use sport, and sport is a beneficiary of that. But it's not necessarily coordinated to be a single point where sport is funded per se.
Terrific. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to turn. I have two questions left here from the audience that I'd really like to ask. Peggy, I'm going to ask you the first one, and then I'll ask all three of you to respond on the last one. Question from the audience is do you think that sport is doing enough to think differently coming out of the pandemic? Do executives need to rethink the business models? Do we have to pay athletes substantially less as professional athletes? Do sports administration structures need to be reduced? Or do you think it's largely about just getting back to normal and in terms of sport?
I think everything is on the table to be looked at again. I don't think the normal that we had 1st of January is going to be what people are looking at. I think the realization of, for a while, we'll have to do as much with less. I think that every organization will be re-examining its purpose and its priorities and how it's going to achieve that with what's available. Because it's not just sport that's been hit, it's been the whole country, it's been every business. I think all the assumptions have been shown to not hold true when you get a pandemic. I think that the funding and just speaking about AFL, the soft cap, the amount of money that you can spend on non-player football has been reduced by 40%. Which means that even if you wanted to bring back and had the money to bring back all the staff that you had to stand down, you can't. I think that's showing they're going to be leaner organizations. I think that as we hear a lot, and I think the Olympic movement is one great example, that people play sport when you start out because you love it. And I think that some of the excellent Aussie rules players and cricket players, they didn't start out thinking, well, I'll make $1 million a year. They started out saying, I want to be on a team, a professional team. And then along the way, the cost of, or the rewards of being on that team got greater and greater because that's what the market would bear. I think we're probably going to look at that all again as well. The AFL Players Association has agreed to certain restrictions on player salaries. So I think everything is up for review, and how to do what we need to do in a smarter, more innovative way. And as I said before, in my competition, the team that gets on top of those issues sooner will be the one that is the most successful, I think. So I think all administrators would be looking at what is going to happen. But we're only a couple of months into this. We haven't seen how it's going to play out. We haven't seen, we can only hope there's no second wave. The way we go about our business every day is going to be different, and sport will be no different.
And one final comment from each of you on the question of, in those states where we have no official cases, and Western Australia, where I am, is one of those, and haven't had for a number of weeks, as is the Northern Territory. What are your thoughts on when do we open up? Matt, final quick comment and we can wrap up.
Well, we open up when the health authorities say that we open up, and I think return to sport. Sport doesn't want to be the cause of an outbreak of the virus whatsoever. But I just hope they coordinate that as much as they possibly can between them, so that we don't get the little bit of a little bit of an argument and debate at the moment between various health authorities, federal, state, and state. So I think. The government's managed the crisis very, very well, and that coordinated effort has been fantastic. And I think that's the result of good planning, good management. It would be nice to see that continues as we start to open the community and the economy up.
Right. And Nick?
Look, much to Matt, obviously opening up borders, listen to the health authorities, that's worked pretty well for us so far. I think sports probably just need to be mindful that they're not hanging their hopes on a return back to the normal anytime soon, and still planning for the disruption to continue for a while. I think it's really important that some of the lessons and some of the positive things that have come out of COVID for sports and connecting using technology, they start capitalising on that now. Start putting that in as permanent measures and things that they can look to different revenue streams. But I think false hope and thinking, in another month everything will be open back up and I can return back to my competition and revenue streams will continue, is probably a dangerous game at this point.
Yeah. And Peggy?
Yeah, I'd have to agree. I think sport doesn't drive this. The health authorities drive this, and each state's different, and they're trying to protect their citizens in what responds to the situation that they're in. So I think we just bide our time and try to save as many lives as we can on the basis of health advice. So just be patient.
Thank you. And that brings us to the end of our time together. I'd like to thank Peggy, Nick, and Matt for their time and your insights. It's been a really rich conversation and under very difficult circumstances. I just would like to let you know on the sports poll, we have rather unexpectedly, the majority of voting is saying that we do believe more funding and support for sports is required. 28% strongly supporting, 28% supporting, 32% neutral, and then only 12% in the noes. I'd like to also thank our audience for joining us today. It's a tricky way to run a panel discussion, but I think we've really explored some the impact of sport in the community and at the professional level. I know as a cricket tragic and a mad sports nut, I've been missing watching my beloved Dockers play and on the park, and I've been missing the tennis at Wimbledon and the French Open. I will miss the Tour de France. And I can only imagine that others in the Australian community are feeling the same, as well as missing being able to play my own sport in my own time. Of course, for our audience, you can continue to post your questions on Pigeonhole if you'd like to for the next 15 minutes. And CEDA will post the responses on an event email. We'll also have this session has been recorded, and that will be available on the CEDA website. So you can revisit it at any time and share it with your colleagues. Of course, as we always do at CEDA, you can stay connected through LinkedIn, through Twitter, through Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook, or stay updated with CEDA's work by visiting www.ceda.com.au. I'd like to thank you all. It's been a terrific hour spent together. Thank you for your time and have a wonderful day. Thank you.